Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Good evening, my viewers, ladies and gentlemen, and particularly my younger people. I'm back with you, your host Salahuddin Choudhry, with the Penta-S Sad Soul segment of YouTube. Today, I have for you a very, very important subject. As usual, I do claim every subject I discuss with is an important one. I hope you will bear with me. If you recall, I'm sure many of you do know, 9th August is a special day. Two reasons. One, the day when in Nagasaki of Japan, the second atomic bomb was blasted by the US bomber. And this was devastation, it was killing, suffering and so on, which goes on till this day. And the second aspect of today, that is 9th August 2022, is the day of Indigenous people of the world. Indigenous people, there's something like ethnic minorities. This is also a very, very important subject because they are the people who have remained impoverished for a very, very long time, for many, many centuries. Almost like the slaves in the Dark Continent and the Americas of those days. I have chosen for you, my good viewers, this subject, and I have captioned it to make it interesting as Indigenous peoples, part of humanity. They matter. They matter. They matter to us, to everybody, to the world. Indigenous people, part of humanity, they matter. You know, ladies and gentlemen, this is the day which is observed globally by the world community. And of course, international days and weeks are occasions to educate the public on issues of concern, to mobilize political will and resources to address global problems, and to celebrate and reinforce achievements of humanity. The existence of international days predates actually the establishment of the United Nations, but the UN has embraced them as a powerful advocacy tool. That is why almost every day there is one occasion or the other that the United Nations has recognized and designated as special world or international days. So this evening, my presentation, ladies and gentlemen, as I narrate, and mostly from the bottom of my heart, because I believe in the people. These people, call them ethnic, call them minorities, call them different religion, call them different people of different sorts, they are part of the humanity. They are just like you, me, they, me, and all of us as human beings. They too are human beings. It is another matter that some of us, regrettably, do not look upon them as such. But we need to do that. Indigenous peoples around the world continue to face overwhelming marginalization, discrimination, and exclusion. These peoples, also referred to as First People, F-I-R-S-T, First People, Aboriginal, not the original, but Aboriginal people, Native people, or autochthonous people, more in the Greek style, are actually, or rather culturally, distinct ethnic groups. They are distinct ethnic groups who are native to a place which has been colonized and settled by another ethnic group. So, by the way, before I go ahead with my next portion of the narrative, I would like to take the liberty and sharing with you my today's special attire, because I want to feel at home with the indigenous people. I do not have the necessary gear. I do not unfortunately have the costume, but I have tried to make believe and put on a small, like a turban, like a cap. And many of them wear something similar. You can see the pictures here. So those are the pictures of the indigenous people of the world. And I have tried to become a part of them by wearing a special headgear, which I improvised. It may not be the same. I've got certain little statues here, these small three fellows there. They are the figurines representing many of these people. And we have got two statues here. They're from Burma. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as I was saying, regarding this special occasion about the indigenous people in the world, I told you earlier, I've got this special arrangement, few statues from the American continent and few statues from the Asian bloc, like Burma, like Africa and so on. And I'm wearing a special headgear just to give a feeling that I am part of indigenous people. So there you are, my narrative of today. And as I said earlier, it's a special day, and the observance is on the 9th of August all over the world as designated by the United Nations. So, this evening's talk presentation, as I begin, indigenous peoples around the world continue to face overwhelming marginalization. They are disadvantaged, discrimination and exclusion. These peoples also referred to as First People, Aboriginal people, Native people, or autochthonous people, I mentioned earlier, are culturally distinct ethnic groups who are native to a place which has been colonized and settled by another ethnic group. The term indigenous peoples refers to culturally distinct groups affected by colonization, as I said earlier. According to WHO, World Health Organization, indigenous populations are communities that live within or are attached to geographically distinct traditional habitats or ancestral territories, and who identify themselves as being part of a distinct cultural group, descended from groups present in the area before modern states were created and current borders defined. They generally maintain cultural and social identities, and social, economic, cultural and political institutions separate from the mainstream or dominant society or culture. Now, rooted in colonization and patriarchy, the indigenous peoples faced profound disparities, sustained by a deeply held resistance to recognizing and respecting their rights, dignity, and freedoms for many, many years or centuries. Indeed, therefore, and rightly so, on 23rd of December 1994, the United Nations General Assembly genuinely felt and initiated and decided by its resolution number 49/214, resolution number 49/214, that the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, designated on 9th of August to be observed every year. The date marks the first meeting in 1982 of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations. Well, the UN Declaration, as mentioned earlier, propounds that throughout modern history, due mostly to colonization, the indigenous peoples have suffered from historic injustices, robbed of their lands and territories, of their political and economic autonomy, and even of their own children, thus preventing them from exercising their right to development in accordance with their needs and interests. Their cultures and languages have been denigrated and extinguished. Very sad. What a pity. The UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the UN General Assembly on 13th of September 2007, with a majority of 144 states voting in favor, and the international community showed its solidarity with the commitment to safeguarding the indigenous peoples and their rights. The Declaration recognizes their right to freedom, equality, self-determination, and protection, mind you, very important, protection from any kind of discrimination, the urgent need to respect and promote their inherent rights of indigenous peoples, which derive from their political, economic, and social structures, and mind you, their cultures, which is extremely important, and spiritual traditions, histories, and philosophies, especially their rights to their lands, territories, and resources. Therefore, in order to raise awareness of the needs of these populations and groups, every 9th August commemorates the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. This year, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs has organized a virtual webinar on the 2022 theme, that is, the role of indigenous women, emphasis on women this year. The role of indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge. Another very important aspect to be given to the indigenous people, and particularly the women, to work on those lines. So, theme year 2022, the role of indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge. There, indigenous women are the backbone, as you will all agree, of those people who are called indigenous and their communities, and play a crucial role in the preservation and transmission of traditional ancestral knowledge. They have an integral collective and community role as menders of natural resources and keepers of scientific knowledge as well. That's it. Many, many indigenous women are also taking the lead in the defense of lands. Mind you, very bold, very strong. They want to show that they can do it. So in the defense of lands and their territories, and advocating for indigenous people's collective rights the world over. More than 70% of the world's population is living in countries with rising income and wealth inequality. That's another shame, including indigenous peoples who already face high rates of poverty. That is again very shameful. High rates of poverty and acute socio-economic disadvantages. High levels of inequality are generally associated with institutional instability, corruption, financial crisis, increased crime, and lack of access to justice, education, and health services. For indigenous peoples, poverty and gross inequities tend to generate intense social tensions and conflicts. You all know about that. Everywhere in the world, even today, there are issues, there are problems which the indigenous people face by the humanity at large. There are over 476 million indigenous people. Very big number. 476 million indigenous peoples living in about 90 countries across the world, accounting for 6.2% of the global population, but account for only 15% of the poorest. They speak an overwhelming majority of the world's estimated 7,000 languages, mind you. 476 million people, but 7,000 languages. They speak of different forms, different backgrounds, different times. And they represent 5,000 different cultures. My God, huge number. So how can we ignore the disadvantaged people, the indigenous people? They have to be recognized. They've got rich cultures, amalgamation with so many languages. So indigenous peoples are the beholders of a vast diversity of unique cultures, traditions, languages, and knowledge systems. Despite their cultural differences, indigenous peoples from around the world share common problems. That's another factor. They share common problems related to the protection of their lands, rights, and distinct peoples. Indigenous people's right to participate in decision making is a key component in achieving reconciliation between indigenous peoples and states. Therefore, a new social contract must combat the legacy of exclusion and marginalization affecting indigenous people throughout their meaningful and effective participation and the obtainment of their free, prior, and informed consent. What is important? Consent, a lack of consent. Consequently, it will lead to meeting their goals of the 2030 agenda as declared by the United Nations. Oh, hold on, I've got that little picture gone, so I'll bring it up to you for your interest, the kind of indigenous people. Okay, now the COVID-19 pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, You see, they also created a lot of problems. This particular injection of this particular disease had shown a light, of course, a light on the effects of growing inequalities and promoted discussion on the urgent need to rethink a new social contract. This was probably a blessing in disguise, a new common sense that will work for all peoples and the planet. It has created a unique opportunity to build back a more equal and sustainable world, one based on genuine and inclusive participation and partnership that fosters equal opportunities for all and respects the rights, dignity, and freedom of all. Last year, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear younger people, who I addressed this narrative in particular for their understanding and for their requirement to give respect and start loving even the indigenous people. So last year, 2021, my younger friends, there was this demand for indigenous people's inclusion, participation, and approval in the Constitution of a system with social and economic benefits for all. Mind you, Constitution, if this is included in the Constitution as a part of legislation, I think wonders can be done. That is why the theme of that year was, last year, that is 2021, the theme was leaving no one behind. Leaving no one behind, indigenous peoples and the call for a new social contract. New social contract. That is important. The social contract was made among the dominant populations. Over recent years and decades, various societies have sought to address this, including through apologies, truth, reconciliation, and efforts concerning legislative reforms. What? Reforms in legislation, as well as reform in the Constitution. So, legislative reforms and constitutional reforms. There lies the secret. While at the international level, these efforts have included the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. What is important? The rights of these people. Despite the existence of international instruments, not all are embarked on the collective journey to ensure that no one is left behind. No one is left behind, including the indigenous peoples. Therefore, the building and redesigning of a new social contract as an expression of cooperation for social interest and common good for humanity and nature is needed. Common good for humanity and nature is essential. The new social contract must be based on genuine participation and partnership that fosters equal opportunities and respects the rights, dignity, and freedom of all. Indigenous people's right to participate in decision making is the key component in achieving reconciliation between indigenous peoples and the states. Now, ladies and gentlemen, to re-emphasize, the indigenous women are the backbone of indigenous peoples' communities and play a crucial role in the preservation and transmission of traditional ancestral knowledge, as I said earlier. They have an integral collective and community role as carers of natural resources and keepers of scientific knowledge. I'm making a repetition for your understanding and to see how important these little things are in the context of women. So many indigenous women are also taking the lead. They're taking the lead, mind you. They are bold in the defense of lands, as I said earlier, and advocating for their people's collective rights in the whole world. So this is a repetition, mind you, ladies and gentlemen, but only to re-emphasize. The significance of indigenous people's traditional knowledge is widely acknowledged long before the development of modern science, which is quite young. Indigenous peoples have developed their ways of knowing how to survive. How to survive. Difficulties, problems. So they learn. They get pushed, at the wall, and they learn in the process. As noted by the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations on Indigenous Peoples, the term scientific knowledge is also used to underscore that traditional knowledge and is contemporary and dynamic and of equal value to other kinds of knowledge. This is interesting. What they learn, they relate to the other forms of education, other forms of learning. So that is, Internal Council of Science of the UNESCO, ICSU, states that traditional knowledge is a cumulative body of knowledge, know-how, practices of representations maintained and developed by peoples with extended histories of interaction with the natural environment. This is another important element. As they proceed, they go by the nature and the environment around them. These sophisticated sets of understandings, interpretations, and meanings are part and parcel of a cultural complex that encompasses language, naming and classification systems, resources and practices, ritual, spirituality, and all other views in the world. However, my good viewers, despite the crucial role that indigenous women play in their communities as bread earners, caretakers, knowledge keepers, leaders, and human rights defenders, they often suffer. What is the key word? They often suffer, they often suffer from intersecting levitations. They suffer from different elements on the basis of gender, class, ethnicity, and socio-economic status. So this is again a kind of a fight or struggle that the women keep on facing or doing. They do the struggles. Their right to self-determination, self-governance, and control of resources and ancestral lands have been violated for centuries. Small but significant progress has been made by these women in decision making as well. In some communities, they are leaders at local levels and national levels and stand at the front lines of defending their lands, cultures, and the communities. So a big burden on the shoulder of the women, amongst the indigenous people. So the reality remains indigenous women are widely underrepresented, disproportionately negatively affected by decisions made on their behalf, and are too frequently the victims of multiple expressions of discrimination and violence, which you see even today. Violence against women, a very common factor, doesn't go away so easily. So much of struggle is going on. Human rights, people, demonstrations, protests, activities, and activism. Despite that, violence against women continues, regrettably, unfortunately. The Committee of Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, highlighted some of the major issues encountered by Indigenous women, particularly noting the high levels of poverty, low levels of education and illiteracy, limitations in access to health, basic sanitation, credit and employment, limited participation in political life, another very important aspect. They are being background, they are being backward. So even participation in political life of the women is negligible. And the prevalence of domestic and sexual violence. Two other broad elements, a big factor, which go on even today amongst all in the communities. Extremely unfortunate, regrettable. So we got to find ways to reform ourselves. So, my good viewers, ladies and gentlemen, the younger people, my dear ones, this is where I stop as the end of part 1 of my narrative about Indigenous peoples who really matter. Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.